So one common approach is an old beat up truck like this. There's pros and cons. Obviously, a truck that this old, it's not going to be super reliable, but it's hard to beat the price. So you're going to be doing some work to it, definitely some some maintenance, and probably a couple of tune-up items when you pick up the truck. Talk about some of those things that most likely would be needing to put some money into. But very basic extended cab, half-ton pickup truck. Not a whole lot to it. Toolbox obviously gives you a little bit more storage for waterproof items, and then the bed you get storage. Took out the center console. It'd be just a little bit easier to get more dogs in here, more storage in the back than just the single cab. Not as much as the crew cab or the actual four-door, full-size four-door. Some real basic upgrades. Truck was already lifted when we bought it, so it's got a 6-inch suspension lift, a 3-inch body lift. Obviously just spray paint job since the original paint was flaking. Just small little off-road lights in the front, and then we got some reverse lights in the back. At one point I had rock lights, like the underside lights, but I never used them, so I took them off. So the reverse lights can be useful because with the windows tinted, it's kind of hard to see in the back. So all those switches kind of out of the way. Wired in down here underneath the dashboard. Otherwise, what you see is what you get. So, like I said, 6-inch suspension lift, 3-inch body lift, 37-inch super swampers on 15-inch steel wheels. It's a pretty big offset, so even with the fender flares, the tires still stick out a decent amount. You can see back here, it's a big obnoxious truck. It does not get good gas mileage, but it gets pretty good ground clearance, and with these tires, it's hard to not get traction in off-road situations. Even in the rain, it gets decent traction because of the siping on these tread blocks. Huge amount of space between the top and the bottom of the tread. So durable, and like I said, they do well in the rain because they do well, and they're designed to do well in the mud. Pretty aggressive sidewall, and then the toughness of the sidewall, the actual construction of the tire. It's a mud tire, so they're designed to take a beating off-road in the mud, specifically like taking the abuse from tree roots and other things that are submerged in the mud as they're trying to get traction. Like I said, it's a half-ton truck, so not a super heavy-duty frame. But this one is a W44, so it's kind of like a special edition where instead of having the normal half-ton rear diff, it has the bigger 3/4 ton. I think it's a 12-bolt diff. Has the 3/4 ton brakes. I think it's just an add-a-leaf. It's a leaf spring in the back. It's not the normal 3/4 ton leaf spring, so it rides a little smoother. But you can definitely tell sitting this truck next to a normal non-W44 half-ton Chevy from this year range that the entire axle housing on this is a lot beefier. So just lift blocks in the back, so you're getting most of the suspension, the 6-inch suspension lift from the lift block right there, 3-inch body lift, so just putting a spacer between the body and the frame. Body lift doesn't get you really that much extra off-road capability, but it does lift the body, so you are technically getting ground clearance from where the body could have impacted off-road obstacles. It's more just getting you clearance from the top of the tire to the bottom of the fender. Whereas a suspension lift will move all the suspension components, including the differentials, down from where the frame starting point is, 6 inches down. Body lift will move everything from the frame up. So suspension lift, frame down, body lift, frame up, and all those components that are tied to that starting point. So you can see that suspension lift, while it does move the entire truck, including the frame up, still the entire front differential, all these suspension components are still pretty low, so then the only way to lift all of those components up and get you some extra ground clearance from, like true ground clearance from the front, is by just getting bigger tires. But in order to get bigger tires, you need more clearance, so that's when you start tying in suspension lift with body lift. The more aggressive the tire is, the more you're gonna have to start doing modifications to like clearance the inner fender liner. Even though these is a big lift, these are huge tires, and it still rubs as you go full lock, like full left and full right turn with the steering wheel. I think these tires would probably also rub on the frame, or at least be close, if this offset wasn't so aggressive. You can tell big offset because of how deep this lip is and how far out these tires push. It'd be even more obnoxious if we don't have the fender flares. So nothing pretty. It's easy to work on though. It's easy to get underneath without even having to lift the truck up because of how tall it is. One other upgrade that does give you a little bit more durability off-road is these trailing arms. So pivot point here in the front, pivot point back there. They're not that difficult to install, and I don't know necessarily that they give you that much more off-road capability or dependability, durability, but it does help keep the rear differential where it's supposed to be. It's more common on like off-road trophy truck, Baja trucks, because of all the torque produced by the engine coming down the drive shaft tends to, it's called axle wrap, twist the differential out of position, because if the only mounting point is the front and rear end of the leaf spring or coilover, whatever type of suspension you have, this is helping prevent some of that twist and keeping the rear differential where it's supposed to be. As far as common upgrades, common tune-up issues on an old truck, depending how beat up the motor and transmission are, you obviously have to do some investment there. Other common issues are suspension, especially on independent front suspension like this. Top and bottom ball joints, tie rod ends, and then actual tie rod, potentially the boots on the CV axles, because if all of these components are old, the rubber boot that keeps the grease in will start to crack, get a hole, all the grease will start leaking out. That allows you to get dirt and water in, which then expedites the wear and tear on those metal components that are tight tolerance, rotating, designed to allow the suspension arms to lift while keeping the tire vertical. So if you get wear and tear on the tie rods, you start losing the precision on the steering, so you start feeling like a dead spot in the steering. Also, it starts to become more difficult to keep the tires both straight, turning the same direction. If this one's worn out, this tire could potentially wander left or right, independent of the other tire. So the worse and more worn out it is, the worse it'll get. And then as far as the ball joints, as those wear out, you'll start to get some slack vertically. So it starts to make it really difficult to keep the tires in alignment. If it gets really bad, you could potentially even have failure. So then the hub that connects the brake to the tire to the rest of the truck, if it fails either here or there, then the entire hub will come out of the lower or upper suspension arm, which obviously would not be good. So suspension components where you can expect to spend a little bit of money and time fixing up, in addition to replacement suspension components like we talked about. Also obvious stuff like brakes, calipers maybe, but more likely to be just pads and rotors. Obviously tires, if you need new tires. Also, it'd be a good idea to have spare parts on some of this stuff. So I've got spare ball joints, spare tie rods, I have one spare CV axle, I have a spare boot, but the boots aren't very easy to change separately from the axle itself. I have a spare power steering pump. So down here, everything's going to be a different position or location on a different truck. I have a spare oil filter. Oil filter is fairly easy to get to. I have spare oil. That's all stuff that you might need to change much more likely to need to change the oil in the filter than the power steering pump, but it's really easy to tell if the power steering pump's going out or leaking. It's not very hard to get to as long as you know how to remove the serpentine belt and get to all that stuff. Also, on this truck at least, the fuel filter is easy to get to up in here. I don't keep a spare fuel filter, but I have changed that fairly recently. And that's definitely a wear item. Maybe shocks would need to be replaced, possibly a spare tire. Fuel pumps don't go out very often. They're kind of hard to get to, so luckily they don't go out very often. As far as engine compartment items, depending on how recently the truck's been tuned up, you might need to get a new alternator so that you're not putting too much wear and tear on the battery. A new battery would be a good idea. Standard tune up on air filter, oil change, oil filter. This truck is just barely new enough to have an OBD2 sensor, so that makes the diagnosing of engine transmission issues a little bit easier because I can plug in a code scanner. So it starts at 1996. Everything older than that is OBD1, and everything after 96 is OBD2. The air conditioner does not work in this, but I don't really care if it's just like a bug out truck. Don't use it very often. That comfort stuff is not the most important for what this truck's designed for. Windshield washer fluid hasn't worked in I don't know how long. Don't care about that either. Need the brakes to work though, so that's been recently overhauled and maintained. Transmission's been rebuilt. It's like a stage 2 AMCO transmission with like heavy duty torque converter and transmission components from like out of the Corvette from this model year. I have had this motor most of the way taken apart. I had the intake valve covers off and the intake manifold completely removed. Needed to replace the intake manifold gasket. In order to get to it, I had to have the intake manifold get off, obviously. Depending on how much of that stuff you want to do yourself, obviously you can do as much or as little as you want. Just expect to need to be putting some money into some stuff like that. The stuff that gets worn out on older trucks like this. This truck's 30 years old almost. So obviously some of that stuff's worn out, even though this motor's been rebuilt at some point in the last 30 years. Still, things like that need to be replaced. Completely different situation where I'd use this truck than some of the other options. If the roads are flooded, like post-hurricane, or there's a bunch of trees across the road, or I'm expecting to go into mud, where not only the truck is going to get muddy, but I will be muddy getting in and out of the truck. I don't really care on a truck like this. If you are going in and out of mud, it's definitely a good idea to increase the height of the differential breathers. It's just a little hose that will come off the top of both the front and rear differential down in there. Just relocate that with just a hose like this. For the back, I've just relocated up to in here. That makes it so that as long as the water level that you're driving through is below this point of the truck, you're not going to be getting water mixing in with the diff fluid, gear oil, and completely ruining all of the gear oil that's down in those differentials. You could do things like snorkels. The newer the truck is, the more you got to be careful with like all of the extensive electronics and expect that nothing is going to work like new. The more you drive it in water, yes, a snorkel will raise the height of the air intake, so the engine necessarily won't vapor lock or hydro lock. It doesn't mean that everything else isn't going to shortly after stop working. Water will likely slip in through the gaps in the doors, start potentially soaking the carpets. So if you have an older truck like this that's a little cheaper, it's not as hard to not be so overprotective about keeping it in perfect shape. So the situations I'd use this truck for is completely different than what I'd use something like this for. I've already talked through this and done a walk around of it. If I'm expecting to do moderate range, maybe living out of the truck, then obviously having the rooftop tent would be convenient. The awning, it's decent off-road with a little lift and some off-road tires. It gets like 18 miles per gallon, so a lot better than 10 like that truck. but nowhere near the 30 miles per gallon that this eco diesel gets. All three of these blend in decently. They're not just obnoxious bug out vehicles. You could start putting roof racks and shovels and traction boards, jerry cans, but that's kind of just drawing attention to yourself. But if you want to go that route, that's totally your option. You can see that all three of these blend in. Both of the trucks blend in really well. It's just like a normal pickup truck. Full size 4-door. You can tell it's a big back door, so a lot of room for family or pets inside. The longer bed, it's not a long bed, but the longer bed with the tonneau cover. So it's a little bit easier to keep your personal items private with the tonneau cover. It does help with noise and a little bit with the fuel economy having the tonneau cover, but most of the things that make this truck specifically noticeably more fuel efficient than that one is the fact that it's got air ride suspension, so to lower the ride height from here to be more aerodynamic on the freeway, less wind and drag from just bigger cross section. Not so much turbulent air going underneath if there's just a smaller gap between that air dam on the bottom and the street beneath it. It's also more rounded as opposed to squared off corners on older style trucks, and it's lighter, and the 3-liter eco diesel motor that this thing has, turbocharged, doesn't make a ton of power, but 30 miles per gallon compared to that 5.7 liter 350 old school gas V8. The old truck has a 26 gallon fuel tank. This has a 33 gallon tank. So just the quick math there, you basically are getting almost 1,000 miles before having to fill this up. It's air ride. It's way more comfortable. It has just as much, if not more, storage because it's the full 4-door. It has what you could call like an all-terrain tire. Not nearly as aggressive of a tread, but still better than a typical like street tire. Not nearly as much ground clearance, but you can get a little bit better ground clearance by putting in the off-road mode by just waiting for the air compressor to pump up the airbags on the 4 corners of the suspension. Raises the nose and the back end of the truck a little bit. This is currently in the aerodynamic mode, so you can tell maybe from the video it's a little bit less clearance between the top of the tire and the bottom of the fender on the front than it is on the back, but from here it'll lift another 2 inches. It'll also lower even from here for the comfort entry mode, so like loading the truck, getting it out of the truck just lowers slightly from there, but still not going to be anywhere near the same amount of ground clearance you can get on a truck like that. Fuel tank skid plate goes from there all the way to here. 33 gallon tank, so big tank. In front of that, I got skid plates for the transfer case, the transmission, the front differential. It's got a decent amount of ground clearance for a newer truck, even with that little aerodynamic splitter down there at the front, but not nearly as much ground clearance as this old truck. You might have been able to tell from the video that eco diesel is fairly quiet, especially for a diesel. This is not quiet. If I can get it to start, I'll show you. But it's kind of like I was saying, older trucks are a little less reliable. It's like you could tell from the video of the other truck raising and lowering the suspension. It idles pretty quiet. It's really quiet when it's driving, especially for a diesel. This, on the other hand, is not quiet. So just to show you the difference. tell this thing makes a bunch of noise, even just idling. It's a lot different than the other truck sitting there idling. This exhaust has been modified. It doesn't have mufflers, it just has the catalytic converters on each side. So they're not all this loud, but that being said, even with a stock exhaust or an exhaust that's been modified to be even quieter than stock, it's still going to be a loud truck. The power steering pump's loud compared to electronic steering on the newer trucks. And just sitting there idling, the engine noise from the intake side and the exhaust side are both going to be louder than it would be on a new quiet truck like that Eco Diesel. So if you're trying to be discreet, this is definitely not the way to do it, besides just how it looks, how it sounds as well. If you're not going to be able to sneak up anybody like on a truck like this.